Hey everyone, this is Joe, and today we're going to talk about just the algorithm for factoring a quadratic where a is equal to 1. So as you recall, when a is equal to 1, we can simplify our expression by kind of suppressing the a term. In other words, instead of having a out front, we can just have x squared plus bx plus c. And if you recall from your class, the algorithm is essentially, can I find two numbers, this n1 and n2, that multiply together to give me c, but they add up to give me b. Now the way we accomplish this is really by listing the factors of c and then find a pair of those factors that add up to b. And then finally we put that answer into a factored form. Alright, now that we went over the algorithm, let's go into some example problems. So the way I like to make these videos is I want to go over three types of problems, essentially an easy problem, a medium problem, and a hard problem. This is so that if you feel comfortable with all three problems, you'll feel comfortable with any problem your teacher can throw at you on a test. So let's begin with the easy problem. I think the easiest problem for this is when c is prime, or the difference between b and c is 1 or negative 1. This simply is too easy because when we look at c here and we list out its factors, if c is prime, its only factors are 1 and c itself. And since in this case we have a positive 3 for c, its only set of factors could be positive 3 and positive 1, or negative 3 and negative 1. Well, we look at what b is 4 here, and so it must be positive 3 and positive 1 because positive 3 and 1 add up to be 4. Otherwise, if it was going to be negative 3 and negative 1, b would be negative 4 here. This simply is too easy of a problem, because for either of these cases, x plus 1 or x minus 1 is going to be a factor. In other words, the difference between the absolute value of c and the absolute value of b is just going to be 1 or negative 1 here. So for this particular problem, you can live by the motto, if c is prime, then you'll be fine. So now let's move to the medium problem. A good medium level problem for this would be if c is negative and it has a few factors. Essentially, that forces us to list out a couple different factors and then compare them to find out which ones add up to b. For this problem, we have c equal negative 200 and we have b equal 17. As you recall, the first step, we got to find all our factors of c. So obviously the first factors we're going to list is going to be 1 and c itself. So in this case we have positive 1 and negative 200 and negative 1 and positive 200. But since b is positive, we know that the larger factor of c is going to be positive and the smaller factor of c is going to be negative. And so we can cancel out 1 and negative 200, and we can continue on listing our factors with the smaller one being negative and the larger one being positive. We'll continue down the smaller factor list. So what about negative 3? Well, negative 3 doesn't multiply by anything that get 200, so we move on to negative 4. Negative 4 times 50. What about negative 5? We have negative 5 times 40. We don't get anything for negative 6 or negative 7. But what about negative 8? Well, it looks like negative 8 times 25 is also a choice. Now, one thing we haven't been doing while we're listing is actually adding these values up. So while you're listing out these factors, it's important that you keep checking what their sums are. Now, we know negative 1 and 200 is 199, but if we add all these up, we'll see that we already have our answer in front of us. And that is negative 8 plus 25 is 17. And so we can write the factored form as x minus 8 times x plus 25. So as you go forward on these problems, just make sure that you remember that your factors of c must add up to b. And while listing your factors, be sure to check what their sum is. And now it's time for our hard problem. Oh, I don't know, maybe not that hard. If you can solve this, why don't you put the answer down in the comments? Let's turn it down a little bit though. Now, as we turn this down, I do want to make a comment that I think most of the problems you're going to see in the classroom are really going to be at the easy and medium level that I've already shown. And so what I'm going to do for the hard problem in this video is kind of talk a little bit abstractly about this process. And when I say that, we're going to not really use numbers for a little bit, so stick with me. Now, as you can see, I'm using letters instead of numbers, but we really don't have to interact with it all that differently. We can really think of the J, the O, the E, and the Y as independent numbers all multiplied together. So in a way, I have 4 numbers multiplied together here as my C term. And as you can see for my B term, I have my number j times my number e minus my number y times my number o. And so really what we should be able to do is factor this pretty quickly. And if you can factor it quickly, you probably don't need to watch the rest of the video. But let's press on. So just like we've been doing, let's list our factors of c. So c here is negative Joey. One of my factors is going to be negative 1 times Joey. Similarly, we get negative 1 times Joe, A Joe, and O Yuj as potential options as well. This comes from the commutative property of multiplication, as I'm sure you've heard in class. Now, I know negative 1 times Joey isn't my answer for B, and so why don't we move one of the letters to the left side and multiply it by negative 1? So we could bring the J over, we could bring the Y over, we could bring the E over, we can bring the O over. And if you check quickly, if you add these values together, any of these pairs, we still don't get our answer B. So why don't we look at maybe 2 values on the left side? Now we got negative Joe times A, we got negative Yij times O, we got negative A times Joe, and we got negative O times Yij. None of those add up to G minus Yo, or B value, and so we must press on. I do think if we switch these middle 2 values, the O and the E, the J and the O, the Y and the J, the E and the Y, we might get our answer. After switching those values, you can see in the second and the fourth column, we have values that will add up to our B term. And so what we can do is we can put our answer in our factored form, and we are done. Hopefully this was a little bit helpful, and thank you for spending some time with me.